The following content is intended for a mature audience. Viewer discretion is advised. Illustrations were done by myself. Any inconsistencies between illustrations and the story at large is because I'm an idiot. With that being said, welcome to the Legends of Theia, Halloween Special Number 1. Lost in the Corn. A hefty six-wheeled truck was trekking its way across a harsh and unforgiving frontier world. The man sitting at the wheel of the off-road vehicle was named Harold, and to his side was his wife, Jolene. The two of them were speaking back and forth, on the verge of arguing. "Harold," his wife said. "It's bumpy, Harold. Why is it so bumpy? Can't you drive any smoother?" "No, darling. There are no roads outside of the city limits. Out here, we have to drive on rocks and dirt. It's what's called off-roading. It's very bumpy, and there are no roads for us to take." "Oh, Harold. Why couldn't we take the train, Harold? It's so much smoother." "Yes, my love, the train is much smoother, as I suggested. But you wanted to be at your mother's on time, and the trains have been delayed and rerouted recently. We would almost certainly have to extend our travel plans by nearly 3 days. This is the fastest, I can assure you." As the six-wheeled truck burst from the tree line, it landed onto a grassy field. Smooth driving was now abound. "Oh, that is much better, Harold. You're doing a wonderful job now." "Thank you, my love, but again, it is not me, it is the ground we are riding upon that controls the bumps." "Well, either way, I say we stick to this smoother ground, then." "We will if we can, darling." The truck continued to roll along the grassy meadow until the meadow's end, where Harold looked up and saw the sight of a strange, ominous obelisk sitting at the end of the meadow. Beyond the obelisk was a large, sprawling cornfield. Harold looked up at the strange stone structure. He quickly pulled out a map and began to unfold it. "What's wrong, Harold?" his wife asked. "That stone structure in this cornfield, it's not on any of our maps." He began looking at the map and trying to figure out where they were. "Right here, this entire place should be a sprawling meadow, but that's here instead. This map was updated maybe only a month ago." He began to tap the map with his fingers. "My darling, we will have to go around this cornfield." His wife looked out the passenger side window, then outside of his passenger side window. "But Harold, this cornfield must stretch on for miles. That will take us forever." "I'm aware of that, my darling, but these large stone obelisks, typically the Fae use them to mark their territory. They mean no trespassing. You do not want to pass one of these obelisks if it's erected in your area. Better just to go around." Harold sharply turned the wheel and began driving. His wife began to criticize him. "The Fae. I've heard of these ridiculous things. Harold, that's nonsense. It's the stuff of legend, make-believe. It's not real." "It is real, my darling. I've seen enough people down at the Adventurers Guild." "Where you get drunk," she interrupted. "Yes, where I enjoy an alcoholic beverage or two. But I have seen the results of trifling with the Fae. I've seen men flattened alive, yet still breathing. I've seen what happens, my darling. It is best if we just go around this territory. Best not to trifle with the Fae." His wife scoffed at him as they continued to drive past the corn. "Fae. What does that word even mean?" "It is an acronym, my love. It stands for Fast Adapting Evolutionist. The Fae are in a state of constant mutation, and they are by far some of the most technologically advanced people on this planet. They are so technologically advanced and so heavily mutated from their evolutionary process that they no longer look human, my love. In fact, we would likely not recognize them as human at all." "Oh, very well, Harold. Take your superstitions with you. I can assure you, darling, they are not superstitions. They are quite real. We simply live sheltered lives inside the city limits, but I've heard stories from many of the adventurers in the guild." Harold continued to drive around the corn, in fleeting silence as his wife had her tongue stolen by frustration. Until she looked out Harold's window. She suddenly pointed. "There, Harold! There! Stop the truck!" Harold slammed upon the brakes. "What is it, darling?" "There's a road right there." Harold looked over at the cornfield. He saw a very clear gravel road leading amongst the corn cobs, traveling right through the large cornfield and to the other side. It would only take us a few minutes to go across the entire field. No one would notice, and no one would blame us for using a road that is already paved. He looked down at the gravel. Yes, it is a well-maintained road, a very rare thing on this planet. I suppose it wouldn't hurt, but if anything goes wrong, my darling, you must stay in the truck, and above all else, you must not blame me, he scolded her. "Oh, I don't blame you for everything, Harold." "Yes, of course, my love," he said as he began to turn the wheel. As the truck began to travel down the gravel road, Harold paid close attention to the cornfield. He was looking for anything on the horizon, anything that may be watching them, following them, or tracking their progress. Yet all he could see was the large rows of corn, the tall truck allowing him to look over their tops. "I don't see anything. We should be scot-free." "Harold, why is the road turning yellow, Harold?" Harold looked closer at the gravel road. It was in fact turning yellow. "Well, it's not a yellow brick road," Harold joked, but his wife didn't understand. "You read too many books, Harold." As the truck began to slow, despite Harold pressing on the gas, he became curious as to why things were moving so sluggishly. He tried to squint his eyes and look closer upon the road, but couldn't tell as to why it was shining a bright yellow and reflecting the sun. Eventually, the truck came to a stop, and its tires spun in place, all 6 of them. "Harold, why have we stopped, Harold?" "Because the vehicle is stuck, my dear." "Wait here. Do not leave the vehicle. I shall investigate." Harold opened the door of the truck and jumped out. His feet immediately sank down on the ground a bit. As he began to walk, he realized quickly what the problem was. "Corn," he said. "This entire road is paved with corn kernels." He pushed his hand into the ground. The corn was deep. Is this some kind of storage trough for corn? Perhaps not a road at all? As he attempted to scoop the corn from underneath the tires, there was only more corn the deeper and deeper he scooped. The entire truck was beginning to sink down a bit. "Oh no, I can't expect a tow out here, and I would hate for the locals to locate me." "Darling, stay in the truck. I'm going to try to see if there's something that can get us out of here." Harold began to fiddle with the back of the truck, looking all around and even crawling underneath it, until finally his fussing and noise grew silent. Jolene grew impatient over the many minutes she was waiting. "Harold, what are you doing back there?" She peered her head out the window, but did not see her husband. "Harold!" She moved over to the driver's side and peered her head out the window, but still did not see her husband. "Harold!" She walked back through their living quarters that the truck was towing, and peered out the back door, but still did not see her husband. "Harold, wherever have you gone?" she asked. Carefully, she jumped from the back door and landed her feet into the corn kernels. Immediately, she sank down in deep. "Harold, whatever are you doing out here?" As she tried to move her legs, she found she couldn't, and she started to sink down faster. "Harold! Harold!" She called out her husband's name as she continued to sink. She screamed and reached out for the truck's frame, but the truck was sinking as well, nor did she have the ability to reach it anyway. Before she had the opportunity to utter her husband's name another time, she had sunken down completely in the corn, and after only a minute, all traces of their presence in trespassing on the land were erased in the corn. Jolene lost her sense of what was up and what was down. Eventually, she found herself arising from the corn and stumbling about. When she finally found her footing and stood straight up once more, she looked around and was in a completely different place, an alien arrangement around her. She looked up to see large concrete walls, standing nearly 30 feet high, all around her. Upon them were paintings of corn stalks, lining the walls and going down as far as she could see. On the ground was nearly a foot of corn kernels lining the entirety of the passageway she was within. And standing in bewilderment behind her as she turned about was her husband Harold. "There you are, darling. I was wondering how long it would take for you to step out of the truck and end up in the same place as myself." "Harold," she replied. "Where are we, Harold?" He shrugged his shoulders. "I have no idea. It appears to be a maze." "A maze, Harold?" She looked around at the large walls, how they gapped open occasionally, and more walls were on the other side of the gaps. "What kind of maze is this?" she asked. "A corn maze, I suppose," he answered. "That's not funny, Harold. Do not make humor of this situation. And where is the truck? How are we to leave here?" "I do not know, darling. I also do not know the second question, darling. I suppose we just start walking then." As they started to walk throughout the large maze, Harold would occasionally stop what he was doing, walk over to the side, and shuffle his feet about. "What are you doing, Harold?" his wife asked. "I'm making arrows in the corn. They can barely be seen, but with how level the corn is, our footprints plus these arrows should tell us where we've been and where we are going." "I can't believe we're in this situation, Harold. How could you have lost the truck?" "My darling, I do remember explicitly telling you to stay within the truck, and, if anything were to go wrong, that you were not to blame me." "Well, I don't see how it could be anyone else's fault, Harold." "Because, my darling, if I do recall, I had said we should go around the cornfield. You are the one that had us take a road going straight through the cornfield." "It's a road, Harold. It's meant to be used. Anyone can use a road." "Anyone can use a public road, my darling. That was a private road, and that obelisk was very clear we were entering Fae territory." "Ugh, the Fae. Silly things that probably aren't even real. My darling, we've been teleported into a concrete corn maze. The topography of the area is completely different from where we left. I can assure you the Fae are quite real. People have met them and talked to them. There's one in our own city." "There is?" Jolene asked. "Yes, darling. There is a Fae living within our city." "Whatever does it do?" "Well, it is a large plant that lives in the black market, and, depending upon what items you sell it, it is willing to trade with you certain other items of high value." "What sort of items does it desire?" she asked. "Well, from adventurers who go about outside of the city limits, typically human corpses." "Human what?" "My darling, far outside the city limits, not upon the path that we were traveling, but farther, there are raider gangs that steal supplies and plunder, pillage, and loot. And sometimes firefights occur between them and our own adventurers along with our security forces. And the Fae within our city is more than happy to purchase the corpses that result from those firefights." "And what exactly does this Fae give in return?" "Well, a friend of mine showed me a small trinket that the Fae handed him as a gift. It appeared to be a small notepad, but upon every page was a photograph of bottles of water upon every single page of the notebook. When he ripped a page out of the notebook, the page began to expand until it eventually turned into a bottle of water. He had nearly 300 pages in a very lightweight notebook he could keep in his front pocket. "Of what value is that?" she asked. Harold scoffed. "If you don't know the value of that, you're probably not cut out to be outside the city limits anyway. We probably should have taken the train." As Harold and his wife continued to walk, eventually, Harold heard a shuffling in the corn behind him. "My darling, is that you?" "No, Harold. Why?" They both turned back, and they could see something dotting the horizon. It was approaching fast, making an awfully loud sound as it approached. "What is that, Harold?" Harold squinted his eyes a bit. He could see something black and ominous filling every available space within the labyrinth as it approached from behind quickly. Harold continued to look at the object as he spoke to his wife. "That, my darling, is the reason why we are going to start running now." "Harold, I cannot run in these shoes." "Then remove the shoes," he said clearly. "Remove my shoes? I just paid for these shoes. These shoes are quite expensive." "Then carry them, but either way, take them off and start running, now!" He began to yell at his wife. "Don't shout at me, Harold," she said as she began to unbuckle her shoes. Hurry it up, he hurried his wife. As the object came clearly into view, it was revealed to be a soft yet giant rubber tire, filling all available space in the labyrinth and rolling along the corn. "Run, darling," he said as he dragged his wife forward. "I'm running as fast as I can, Harold. Don't shout at me, she repeated. They continued to run along the moving images of corn, until finally they arrived at a depression in the wall, a platform, featuring many fall-themed decorations. Either way, Jolene's husband quickly picked her up and threw her upon the platform. "Harold!" she scolded at him, before eventually he pulled himself up onto the platform as well. The tire passed them by, revealing behind it a rather hefty machine that was sucking up the corn, cleaning it, and then patting it back down onto the ground in a thin, even layer. Harold watched in frustration as the machine passed them by. "God damn it," Harold said as he watched the machine venture up the road. "Harold, your language. That thing erased our arrows, honey. We're not going to be able to navigate this labyrinth without some kind of bearing as to where we've been and where we will be." "Harold, I thought you know where we were." "No, darling. All of those pictures of corn are literally the same picture repeated over and over. They're meant to disorient. There's no way for us to tell where we've been, or where we're going, or where we are." His wife sat there a bit frustrated as she put back on her footwear. "I did not bring good shoes for this, Harold." "Why ever not, darling?" "Well, Harold, I was expecting to go upon the train. You insisted we go off-roading in that ridiculous truck of yours." "It's a rental, my love. It's typically rented by hunters. It's the best possible truck for off-roading and going from point A to point B, and again, we're only doing that to keep to your precious timetable." Jolene looked up at the sky. "Speaking of time, Harold, what time is it?" Harold reached into his pocket and pulled out his small passport device. The electronic newspaper displayed the time, the date, and some recent news events that it had picked up over radio waves. "From the looks of things, it's getting ready to be sundown," Harold ominously foretold. "We cannot possibly stay here, Harold." "We'll have to, darling. We can't be on the roads in the middle of the night, bumbling around and getting lost, and I'd rather not be flattened by that big machine." Harold inspected their surroundings more closely. Upon the platform were several different fall-themed items, such as decorative scarecrows and hay bales, along with some benches. "My darling, I do believe this is a rest area, though I doubt it was designed for us to stay the night. It will have to do." "Well, Harold, where are we going to sleep?" she asked. Harold began to rearrange the hay bales into a square formation. He then took off his shirt and began to scoop corn kernels off of the ground. "You expect us to sleep on corn kernels? It's the softest thing I can imagine us sleeping on, darling." Harold then ripped apart some of the scarecrows and stole their clothing. He put the long-sleeve plaid shirt onto his own body, along with the baggy pants. "Harold, you look ridiculous. Why are you wearing such a thing?" "Because, my darling, the temperature is going to drop soon, and I'd rather have some more clothing on. I suggest you do the same," he said as he emptied the straw from the scarecrow into their makeshift bed. "This is also the best we're going to get for bedding." Jolene rolled her eyes. "Very well, Harold," she said as she absconded with one of the scarecrows herself, and began to steal its attire. The sun was beginning to set, and they had nearly completed their plans for their bedding. That was, until Harold noticed a strange hole recessed into the wall, next to it, a lever attached. "What do you suppose this is, darling?" Jolene looked at the strange hole with the lever. "I'm not certain, Harold. Should you pull it?" "I suppose at this point," Harold began, "it couldn't hurt." He grabbed the lever with his hand and gave it a pull, and hot air began to blow out of the hole. "Well, that's certainly convenient. I suppose we won't be that cold tonight." Eventually, a small white thing came out of the hole and landed upon the ground, followed by more and more. "What is this?" Harold reached his hand into the stream and pulled out what he confirmed to be popcorn. "Is this a free popcorn dispenser?" Jolene lowered herself down into the makeshift bed as light began to wane. "You're not seriously going to eat all that popcorn before bed, are you, Harold?" "My darling, you're going to find that we're going to get really low on energy if we don't eat something. I'm mostly concerned for our lack of water." Harold dumped some of the popcorn from his hand into his mouth and crunched it up. "I suppose it matters not. For now, let us just enjoy the night together and focus on getting out of here in the morning." The couple laid down and drifted off to sleep. They awoke the next morning, salted and a bit buttery. Harold opened his eyes. He could see the morning light being filtered through a white canvas. He could no longer feel the crisp hot air from the popcorn dispenser. He couldn't help but wonder if his wife perhaps turned it off in order to give herself a more peaceful slumber. As he looked left, right, up, and down, he saw that he could only see popcorn. He was now buried in the stuff. Harold could hear crunching and shuffling about. He figured his wife must have woken up already and removed herself from the pile. As Harold sat up and popcorn went everywhere outside of their makeshift bed, he looked about, blinded by the light. He could see the high concrete walls and images of corn placed upon them, and could see the popcorn scattered about along their makeshift bed. But what took him by surprise was the image of a large black creature looming over him. The creature was equal to him in height if they were both standing on their feet bare before each other. It was sitting amongst the popcorn bed, directly on top of where his wife lay. "Jolene," he called out. His wife shuffled underneath the creature. "No, Harold. I wish to sleep longer. These blankets are comfortable." "Those are not blankets, my darling. I suggest you get up." His wife peered up from the popcorn as the strange bird-like entity filled its mouth and began crunching down on the kernels. "Oh my goodness!" she exclaimed as she removed herself from below the creature. "Well, that certainly explains why I was so comfortable all night." Yes, I suppose it does, Harold says, as he got up from the bed and stepped away from the large bird. The bird continued to munch on popcorn, as Harold picked up a stick from one of the disassembled scarecrows. He took his wife's hand, and they both slowly began backing away from the creature, until they were off the platform completely and could begin their journey again. "What is that thing, Harold? An ostrich?" "No, darling," he said. "Although it is definitely the size to be an ostrich, or perhaps bigger, it doesn't look like an ostrich to me. Ostriches do not have such impressive wingspan." "Then what is it?" Perhaps a crow or a raven? I'm not entirely certain, darling. Either way, we're going to back away from it now." Stick in hand, Harold guided his wife away from their makeshift bedding location and continued on their journey. However, they heard shuffling about the corn. When they turned back, they could see that the bird-like entity was following them. "Is it still following us, Harold?" "Yes, darling, it is." "Does it look hostile, Harold?" "I cannot tell, darling. It's just a bird, and it's walking behind us." "Well, it's frightening me, Harold. Chase it away with your stick." Harold swung the stick back and forth, attempting to spook the creature. It only flapped its wings, opened its mouth, and regurgitated a single phrase: "Nevermore." Harold picked up on the odd phrase. "Did you just say, 'nevermore'?" "Nevermore," repeated the bird. "I do believe, my darling, this bird is a raven." "Do ravens say nevermore?" "No, but in classic English literature, there is a story about a raven that can only utter the phrase nevermore. Perhaps this bird is someone's pet, trained to utter that single phrase. Perhaps this bird belongs to the Fae that owns this land." The couple continued to walk as Harold pushed his wife forward. "We can solve this mystery as we keep on moving, darling. We only have so much light before the night falls again." "Nevermore," said the bird. "Well, go on, bird. Tell us your name. Nevermore." "Oh, I suppose that was worth a shot," said Harold, "though I doubt your name is Nevermore." Harold thought carefully. "Perhaps your name is Edgar," he said. The bird shook its head back and forth, repeating the phrase nevermore. "No, huh?" Harold began dragging the stick against the wall, slowly rotating it in his hands, sharpening it like a pencil. "Then perhaps your name is Alan or Poe?" The bird continued to shake its head, repeating the phrase, "Nevermore." "I see," said Harold. His wife chimed into what he was doing, making a strange scraping sound upon the wall. "Harold, that is bothering me. What are you doing?" "I am sharpening this stick, my darling. I don't know what we will come across, but apparently giant birds is on the menu. So I am sharpening this stick in case we need to defend ourselves." "What does that phrase mean, Harold? Why does it keep saying nevermore?" "As I mentioned before, darling, it is a piece of classic literature. I imagine whoever owns this bird is well read." "Nevermore," repeated the bird. Harold grew a dramatic voice. "Quoth the raven." "Nevermore, nevermore, nevermore," said the bird as it bounced around on its feet. "Whatever's gotten into you?" asked Harold. "Quoth the raven." The bird repeated the action over and over. "Is your name Quoth, then?" The bird shook its head. "I see." Harold's wife grew a bit of courage, seeing the odd behavior from the animal. She reached out and pet the animal's head. "Quoth. Well, that seems like a darling name for a friendly bird." "Nevermore," replied the bird. As Jolene was petting the majestic creature, they heard the crackle of an intercom system come to life. It split through the morning air and began to broadcast words loud and clear for all to hear. Welcome, lost souls, to our corn maze, a carnival of fright, an endless haze. You've trespassed here, a foolish plight, but fear not yet, the day is bright. Enjoy your stay, a twisted treat, a haunting journey, dark and fleet. To leave this maze, a simple task. Find the exit gate, a daunting ask. But heed this warning, hear it well. Break the rules and doom will dwell. For those who fail, a dreadful fate, trapped forever, sealed by hate. So wander forth with bated breath, and hope to escape before your death, or join our ranks forevermore, a captive soul, forever sore. As the announcement came to its end, Jolene grabbed her husband's arm. Harold, is that announcement for us? Yes, my darling, I believe so. Either they play that every morning, or perhaps they simply play it only when someone new has entered the maze. Either way, that message was certainly for us. Well, then we should go. There must be a way out. Yes, my darling, but it's a maze. Things are not exactly labeled. So, we just have to keep moving for now. The married couple continued to walk until Harold's stick was brought to a sharp point against the wall. He inspected his handiwork. Harold, whatever are you doing with that? As I said, darling, I might need it for self-defense. Why? It is a maze. Nothing's going to attack us. Sweetheart, we're being followed by a gigantic bird. If that thing were to attack us, I'm not so certain I could fend it off just with this little sharp stick. Harold sighed deeply. It is unfortunate that I got out of the truck without bringing the gun with me. Otherwise, we'd be well armed right now. You brought a gun with us, Harold. Yes, my darling. It is literally the number one thing posted on the exit to every single city entrance and exit. Take a gun with you if you're leaving the city limits. In fact, you should probably have one within the city limits. Harold, you know I have hoplophobia. What if the gun were to go off? Guns don't just go off, my darling. They're an inanimate object. They can only go off if you, the owner of the object, do something you're not supposed to. And what if you do such a thing, Harold? Then I wouldn't be a very intelligent person, my darling. But it's not worth arguing about right now because I don't have a gun. I have a spear, which, unfortunately, I'm not well trained with a spear, my love. Practically on cue, a large oafus creature rounded the corner in front of them. Harold, she said, grabbing her husband's arm. What is that thing? I do not know, my darling. Harold turned around for a second to look at the bird, who had already begun to flap its wings and fly off. Nevermore, it said as it landed upon the wall above them. Well, whatever it is, the bird's frightened of it. Harold held his spear tight. He looked at the oafish creature, a large fat man wearing a pumpkin on his head, carrying a cleaver and a loose-fitting shirt. Jolene, step away from me. But Harold, no arguing, Jolene. Just start walking away. If anything happens to me, start running. The oafish creature began to lumber towards Harold, swinging its cleaver back and forth. All right, you. That's about enough of that. It didn't listen to Harold's attempt at reasoning with it. It swung the cleaver just short of where Harold was, and Harold jammed the spear forward, sticking it into its pumpkin head. Harold's face became filled with shock as the pumpkin came right off the headless creature's neck. It stood still for a moment before falling down into the corn, as Harold watched the pumpkin slide down on his makeshift spear. "Oh, disgusting," he said. "Whatever is that smell?" Jolene reapproached her husband, but quickly covered her nose. "I can't tell if that's the body or the pumpkin, Harold." "I imagine it's both, dear," he said, throwing the spear down, no longer wanting it now that it was covered in rotten pumpkin juice. Harold saw the cleaver sitting amongst the corn, and quickly grasped it in his two hands. Despite its lofty weight, he was able to wield it. "Harold, what are you doing with that?" asked his wife. "Isn't it obvious?" Harold clarified. "A stick for an axe. Sounds like a good trade to me," he said, swinging the cleaver back and forth. "If there's going to be more of these things, we need to defend ourselves." Harold looked on to the large fat man now laying in the corn, but the body was already beginning to sink. It was disappearing into the corn kernels. "Well, that doesn't happen every day," he said. Just like that, the body was gone, disappeared beneath the corn. Harold shuffled around a bit, but as far as he could tell, the corn was only about a foot deep, certainly not deep enough to hide such a gargantuan form, and yet it had truly disappeared. "I'm glad I grabbed the cleaver while I could," said Harold. "Jolene, my darling, are you injured at all?" "No, Harold, but I'm frightened. That was awfully frightening. Whatever did that oafish monster want?" "I do not know, darling," he said. As Harold and his wife continued to walk on, he couldn't help but look back for a moment to notice Quoth digging in the corn where the giant monster had fallen down. It picked up something red and began to follow them on its legs, hopping back and forth. "Whatever is it that you have there?" asked Harold. He reached his hand out, and Quoth happily deposited its goodies into his hand. A small red bag now lay in his hand. Upon opening it, he dumped out several shiny metal objects into his palm. His wife looked on in intrigue at what was sitting in his hand. "They look like pieces of candy," she remarked. "Yes, they do," said Harold. "They're tiny pieces of metal with some kind of acrylic over a picture of a piece of candy. Are these tokens, perhaps? Coins?" Quoth the raven, "Nevermore." His wife seized the small, metal enameled images of candy into her own hands. "They're darling little things either way. Even if they turn out to be worthless, I wouldn't mind keeping them." She placed them all back into the pouch and kept the pouch on her person. "Let's keep going, though, Harold. I'd like to leave this place. That was an awfully frightening experience, and it certainly wasn't worth some little metal pieces of candy trinkets." Harold and his wife continued to trudge through the corn maze for what felt like hours. Every so often they'd see a headless figure approaching them, a pumpkin adorned upon its neck stump. Typically, they said little more than a guttural roar before charging at them with whatever weapon it had on hand, whether it was a stick, a rock, a rake, or a pitchfork. Harold was forced to react quickly each time, trying to strike the pumpkin before the creature was able to strike him. As another of their many assailants fell down and began to sink into the corn, Harold picked up its weapon, a pitchfork, along with the small enamel pieces of candy which he handed to his wife to be placed into the pouch. "Harold, I don't like this. It's only a matter of time before you get hurt." "Yes, I agree," said Harold, catching his breath. "But it's not like I have a choice." Harold handed his wife the pitchfork. "Here you are, darling." "Whatever do I need this for?" she asked. "You need it to defend yourself. If there's multiples of them and I can't take them all on at once, you might have to hold them off for a time. Or if something happens to me, I want you to be able to defend yourself and just keep going forward." "No, Harold! I can't do this. I can't fight one of those things." "Whether or not you feel like you can isn't really relevant to them. They're going to attack you either way." "No, Harold. You can just kill them with that axe thing of yours. It's a cleaver, and I'm tiring out, darling. These things may not attack slow, but I have to swing this thing in order to kill them. You're going to have to defend yourself, he said. Oh, we should have taken the train. Harold shook his head up and down. Yes, my love, I agree, we should have taken the train. But, do you know why the trains have been diverted lately? Because of raider attacks. And everyone on the trains that were attacked by raiders had to defend themselves. Those that didn't, they never made it home. So, you're going to have to learn self-defense either way. You will never be safe. It's not going to happen, my love. No matter where you go, no matter what you do, you're going to have to learn to defend yourself. No, Harold, she replied. No, I don't want to do this. I don't want to be some ruffian who goes and fights and blood and getting hurt. I don't want that. Harold hoisted up the cleaver and rested it upon his shoulder. I agree, but do you know what I say every time I carry a gun about the city limits? She ignored him. I remind myself that I get to decide whether or not I have it. I don't get to decide whether or not I use it. That is often up to the other party, and that means that they will always have the drop on me. Sweetheart, you are going to have to learn to defend yourself. This pacifism that you have, it is not a virtue, it is just an ideology. It's just something you're living by, but are you willing to die for it? Jolene held up the pitchfork to her face, looking at the pointy tips. Well, what if they just take this thing away from me, Harold? Jolene, my love, how can they take your weapon away from you if you're using your weapon against them? Well, they could just grab it and take it away from me. That would mean you're not swinging it, sweetheart. That would mean you're not trying to defend yourself. And either way, they're monsters. They'll kill you regardless. What does it matter if they take away your weapon? I cannot do this, Harold. I just cannot do this. Fine. I'll handle everything in front of us. If anything comes up from the rear, that's what you handle. Understood? She looked behind them. Nothing had approached them from behind as of yet. Fine, Harold, fine. We'll do it that way. Just let's keep going. For an hour they continued to walk. Harold was getting tired as he swung the cleaver back and forth. Enemy after enemy fell, sinking down into the corn. Harold put the cleaver on the ground for a moment to catch his breath. Sweat was running down his face and beginning to stain his clothing. Jolene screeched her husband's name as she watched an armored knight round the corner and begin approaching them from the front. "Harold!" she screamed. "Look, Harold! Look at that one!" Harold looked up from his weary state and picked up the cleaver with all his might, bringing it up to his head. "Oh my goodness," he said, "that one's covered in armor." The knight was taller than Harold. A face-to-face between it and himself would be more like eye to nipple. It wielded a long two-handed sword, which it raised high into the air before bringing it down with crashing force against the ground. Harold managed to easily move out of the way. The creature moved slowly and methodically. "Darling, step back. If I fall, just start running." "Harold! Be careful, Harold!" When Harold swung the cleaver, the knight pivoted in his position, moving only slightly but quickly to move out of the way of the blow. Then, letting go of the sword, he'd strike Harold, knocking him to the ground. As Harold was busy fighting the armored knight, a slinking was coming up from behind. Jolene looked back to see something crawling throughout the corn. Jolene cried out for Harold. "Harold! Harold, something's coming!" "I'm busy," he replied, as he dodged another blow from the colossal knight. Jolene paid closer attention to what was crawling through the corn. It was the torso of a woman cut in half. She had no head and was wearing a pumpkin instead. "There's another one behind us, Harold. What do I do?" Harold could only glance at his wife for a moment before getting punched by the knight. "Would you please stab that thing, honey?" The torso of the woman began crawling after Jolene, and Jolene moved back in response, trying to not let it grab her. "Harold, I can't do this." Harold, please help me." "Busy," he replied. She held the pitchfork in her hand and pushed it out forward, but didn't push it nearly hard enough to pierce the pumpkin. Instead, the torso grabbed onto the pitchfork and clung onto it with all its might. Jolene became frightened and dropped the pitchfork. It ignored the pitchfork and continued crawling after her. "Harold! Please help me, Harold! Please just help me!" "I can't, my darling," he replied. She continued to run away from the torso. As Jolene was busy doing laps around the small section of labyrinth, a pair of legs with no torso upon them walked from behind. It passed by Jolene and its own torso chasing her, and moved over to Harold, where it sharply kicked him in the rear, causing the knight to get a heavy blow with the pommel of his sword against Harold's face. Harold, now angered, shouted at his wife, "Bitch, would you fucking kill that thing already? Just fucking stab it!" "Harold, don't shout at me. I'm doing the best I can." Before he could say anything more, the knight managed to get another blow on him, this time with a heavy kick. He brought the sword high up into the air and swung it towards Harold, but Harold was able to move out of the way. Now he had to deal with two opponents, a pair of torso-less legs constantly kicking at him, and a heavy knight swinging a dangerous sword. If things didn't change soon, Harold would almost certainly meet his end. The torso managed to grab Jolene's legs, bringing her down into the corn, where it then climbed on top of her. "Harold! Harold, please do something! It's attacking me, Harold!" Harold, being frustrated by the entire situation and not being helped at all, took a hard hit from the tip of the sword against the cleaver. He then grabbed onto the sword's blade and pulled the knight in closer to him. The knight attempted to kick Harold, but to no avail. Harold then grabbed onto the knight's arm and began climbing his heavy armored body. "Get over here!" Harold shouted. The knight tried to punch and stab Harold, but to no avail. Harold managed to grab onto the jack-o'-lantern that was atop his head. He forced one of his hands into the jack-o'-lantern's left eye. There, he had a good point for climbing up the rest of the way. He wrapped his arm around the rest of the jack-o'-lantern and crushed the fruit in his own hands. The small flickering flame inside of the pumpkin went out, and the knight fell lifeless to the ground. Harold laid there as the armored knight began to sink into the corn, tired, exhausted, but otherwise unharmed except for a few minor injuries. Harold looked up at his wife, who was still wrestling with the torso of a woman. "Honey, just push it off of you." "Harold, it's on me, Harold," she shouted out. "Get it off me! Get it off me!" Harold took a deep breath. He then pushed the legs over and walked over to his wife, where he easily pulled off the torso from her. "Sweetheart, this torso belongs to a woman who is younger, smaller, and weaker than you. You could easily overpower it." He then threw the torso to the side, letting it land in the corn, the pumpkin growling at Harold. "You stab it," he said. "Fucking stab it right now with that pitchfork. Just pick it up, stab the pumpkin." "No, Harold, no!" "You're afraid of yourself. You're not even afraid of anything at this point. There's no danger here. Just stab the pumpkin." Harold, in frustration, walked away from his wife and sat down in the corner. The torso-less legs followed him, where they tried to kick him repeatedly, but he eventually pulled them down to the ground. "Stop it," he said. Not that the legs could hear him. He looked on at the severing point between the legs and the torso, and noticed it was a completely smooth and clean cut, with almost cartoonish-looking levels of gore upon the smooth surface. "That's not what that should be," Harold said to himself. "That should be organs and bone and things like that, meat." He felt it with his hands. The cut was smooth and didn't seem to have the qualities of normal meat. But upon placing his hands against the legs of the creature, it felt like a real woman's legs, warm, and he could detect a pulse. He looked up and saw his wife back to running away from the torso. Sweetheart, that thing is having trouble getting to you because of its breasts. It literally is having difficulty crawling over its own body. Just stab it, he said. That's easy for you, Harold. Violence comes naturally to you, Harold. But I am not a violent person, Harold. I cannot do things like this. He took a deep breath and put his hand on his head. Sweetheart, this is a decapitated torso with no legs. It's not like a person. It's a monster. You can just swing your thing over there and stab it. I don't care what you do. Just take care of it yourself while I rest. The legs were no longer trying to kick Harold. Instead, they just sat nearby, likely because the pumpkin they were attached to was trying to focus on Harold's wife. He reached over to the legs and moved them from where they were sitting onto his lap. This thing's got a nice ass, honey, he shouted out to his wife. Stop it, Harold. You're making fun of me. Stop it. Harold placed his index finger into his mouth, then his middle finger. He then placed his pinky finger into his mouth and bent his ring finger towards his palm. Here, honey, I'll give you a hand. Suddenly, the torso began to shudder and shake, as though it could no longer focus on what it was doing. It grabbed at the corn and had fistfuls of it, which it threw at Harold's wife. It could no longer chase her to such a degree that she was forced to run around. Now she had plenty of time to decide what to do. She picked up the pitchfork, and with all her might, which wasn't much, stuck it into the top of the pumpkin. She then followed by stomping on the pitchfork with her leg until it finally stuck into the pumpkin enough to extinguish the flame. Finally, the torso stopped moving and sank down into the corn. Before it sank completely, its hand rose from the corn. It made a fist and extended its pinky and thumb and shook the motion back and forth towards Harold. Jolene immediately became angry with her husband. She threw down the pitchfork hard. Why wouldn't you help me, Harold? Help you? He said. Why wouldn't you fucking help me? Did you not see the giant metal knight swinging a broadsword at my face? I could have been decapitated. I could have been killed. I could have been killed too, Harold. By what? An unarmed torso of a woman half your size? The biggest thing about her were the double D's dragging through the corn, slowing her down, he said angrily. You're being vulgar, Harold. You're being vulgar. The two of them huffed and wouldn't speak to each other. As the fighting was over, the bird flew back down and landed in the corn between them. Nevermore. The path that they had chose throughout the maze eventually led them to a small roundabout, with many different paths leading off in different directions. Harold looked at the roundabout. Rather than corn upon it, there was grass, and a single tree planted in the middle. The tree was impressive, imposing, and tall, but devoid of leaves. This, Harold began, must be the spot where that huge machine that cleans the corn can turn around and go into any other direction. It's just a roundabout. He got out of the corn and onto the grass and approached the tree. It'll be a place for us to stop. Probably not for the night, but for a quick breather. As Quoth the Raven jumped up into the large tree, Harold and Jolene both looked down one of the paths. They could hear the unmistakable winding of an air-powered engine. It came closer and closer. They thought for certain they would see another one of those large machines, but instead, a rather odd, old-timey contraption came down one of the lanes, being driven by a headless woman with a pumpkin instead of a head, and a witch hat adorning the pumpkin. This pumpkin, however, was not carved with a horrifying face or 1,000 eyes. Rather, it had a friendly smiley face, with several eyelashes growing from each eye. The vehicle drove around them in the roundabout for a moment, circling them multiple times as the pumpkin girl waved. The vehicle then came to a halting stop right in front of them. The headless woman then jumped up onto the crates in the back of the vehicle and sat upon them. She opened two of the doors in the back of the vehicle, now displayed a small shop. Music began to play, and she began to sing. "Trick or treat, smell my feet, give me something good to eat," she said as she sat dangling her legs above her store. Harold couldn't help but curiously walk to the back of the vehicle and take a look at what the creature was doing as he lofted the heavy cleaver over his shoulder once more. As Harold was joined by Jolene next to him, the pumpkin-headed woman began to speak. "What can I get for you?" Jolene held out the pieces of candy. "These are money, correct?" "That's right," the pumpkin-headed woman replied. "You have plenty. You could afford to buy a number of items, and I'd be happy to provide them for you." Jolene began to point at bottles of water, as well as food and warmer clothing, but Harold stepped in and stopped them both from making a transaction immediately. "No, honey, we have to think about this." "But Harold, we need these things. We need to be warm at night. We need food and water." "I know that, darling, but we're getting attacked all of the time. We need something else." He then gestured to a firearm that was on display. "No, Harold, no," she said. "I know you're afraid of guns, darling, but we need a gun. We can't keep fighting knights with cutlery. We have to have something of substance to actually take them down quickly. I'm wearing out and I can't defend you forever, and you're barely any help defending yourself as is." "Fine, Harold, fine. Just buy the stupid thing then." "Hang on, we have to think about this carefully," he said. He then carefully inspected all the various items in the store. It ranged widely, from weaponry, ammunition, to food and water, clothing. A single small item, almost forgotten at the very bottom of the store, caught Harold's eye. "What is a maze pass?" The happy pumpkin-headed woman, kicking her legs back and forth, clapped her hands. "Why, that's where I drive you out of the maze, silly. I know how to get around, even if the maze is constantly changing shape." Harold looked at his wife with a bit of a stunned expression. "Did you just say the maze is constantly changing shape?" "Of course. Most people have to buy a maze pass to get out." "Then we'll take the maze pass." The pumpkin-headed woman shook her head back and forth. "You don't have anywhere near enough money for that." Harold and his wife looked at the price. The price was staggeringly high. "Oh, God damn it," said Harold. "Watch your language, Harold." From the looks of the price of the maze pass, it would take them multiple days to earn enough money, especially at the rate they were going now. Harold reached out his hand and selected a 9mm pistol called the Trencher. "This is what we're going to buy." "Harold!" scolded his wife. "I don't like guns, Harold. You can't just have one of those things around." "Darling, we need to be able to defend ourselves," he said. "Besides, this gun is not going to be held by me, it's going to be held by you." "Harold! I can't hold one of those things." "You have no choice, my love. You need to be able to defend yourself, and I've seen that you're not physically able to swing a weapon. So, you're going to have to wield this pistol." Harold waved his hand, begging his wife to come closer. "I'll show you how to be safe with a gun, and you only fire when I tell you to. When I tell you the word fire is when you'll pull the trigger of the gun. Otherwise, you can just stay at the ready and you won't have to shoot anything. But first I need to tell you how to be safe with a firearm." "No, Harold, no." "Sweetheart, you constantly pulling away is what's going to get us hurt. I cannot defend both of us. You have to defend yourself, and I have to defend myself. And then working together, we'll defend each other. But if you refuse to partake, then it's just me protecting both of us, and I'm not going to be able to do it. So you have to hold this weapon." "Fine, Harold. Show me what to do." Harold noticed that the shop also sold some basic ear protection, and bought some for him and his wife. He then shared with his wife the basics understanding of how to use a firearm safely. "This gun is always loaded, my darling. Even if it is not loaded, it is still loaded. Treat all weapons like they are loaded. Do not point the barrel at anything you are not willing to destroy. He explained the concept that bullets penetrate through targets, and continued on. The entire time his wife was trying to pull away. She didn't want to engage in the lesson. "Harold, I just can't do something like this." "I know that, but in the event that I should fall, I want you to be able to get out of here alive, okay? So you just need to pay attention and do as I say." Harold explained the full ritual to loading the particular weapon he had purchased. Then, when his wife was ready, he fired it into the ground. The loud, shocking sound sent a jolt through his wife's body. "All right, honey, it's your turn," he said, as he held the weapon up in an unloaded state. "No, Harold, no," she said. "That's far too scary. I can't do something like that. It could hurt me." "Sweetheart, every single moment you do this, you're hurting yourself. You're asking to be killed or maimed in this place. Just join me and fire the weapon." "No, Harold, no." Before Harold and his wife started the interaction, they placed all of their money on the shop's counter in order to get the shop to open up and let them look at things. By all technicalities, he had not yet purchased the firearm, but was allowed to hold and use it, even practice with it for a moment. As he was arguing back and forth with his wife, the headless shopkeeper began swinging her legs back and forth in front of her various goods for sale and sang along to the fall-themed music. It was annoying to Harold. His wife was uncooperative. The shopkeeper seemed to be from a completely different world entirely, with her happy, almost goofy childlike persona. And as far as he could tell, everything was stacked against him to get out of here alive. Finally, he exploded and shouted at the shopkeeper. "Would you shut that goddamn music off already?" he said. The shopkeeper's pumpkin distorted. Rather than a happy smile it was displaying, it now had a rather neutral-looking, unenthusiastic face. "Harold! Harold!" Jolene interrupted him. She pointed at the various prices, including the price of the gun he had already grabbed. All of the prices went up slightly. "See what you've done now, Harold? You've upset her." Harold looked at the prices. They were so high, it would take them even longer to make it out of the maze for certain, but it also meant that firing ammunition from a gun would no longer be a feasible option if Harold wanted to actually make money. Hold on, Harold said. "No, you hold on," clarified the headless pumpkin woman. "This is our festival, and it's our time to have fun. If you don't like that, then I suppose I should be a more serious shopkeeper and focus on making money, shouldn't I?" Harold looked at the prices. They were so high he couldn't even imagine affording a meal. Harold grew a bit frustrated. "Are you fucking kidding me?" Just then, the price of the weapon went higher than the amount of money Harold had, and in that moment, the weapon was almost magically taken from his hands. It immediately clung to the back of the vehicle. "What was that, magnetism?" Harold said as he looked at his arm. Hold on, we can negotiate this." "I sincerely apologize for shouting at you," said Harold. But the pumpkin-headed woman only shook her head back and forth. "You want to be all serious and not enjoy the festival that you trespassed into? Fine. My prices can just keep going higher." No, Harold said. "I am willing to cooperate with the festival and all of whatever it is that you like to do here. Let's just get those prices back down to when we first arrived." "Fine then," the pumpkin-headed girl said. "Here, smell my feet and I'll put the prices down." "What?" Harold asked. "You wanted to have a good time, let's have a good time," replied the woman. "Oh, for goodness sakes, Harold. There are people who pay to do something like that. Just do it so the prices go back down and we don't die." "That is what I've been telling you this entire time. Just do things so that we don't die." "Oh, Harold, you're being ridiculous. This whole place is ridiculous." "It's meant to be ridiculous," said the shopkeeper. "This is Fey territory. You're the ones who entered. And she's the one who made us trespass, he said, pointing at her. Well, I'm very happy you did. We love trespassers here. Well then, why do we have to go through all of these jumps and hoops? The jumps and hoops are what we're looking forward to, replied the shopkeeper. Jolene stepped up. Oh, for goodness sake, Harold. Harold watched as the prices went back down to what they were normally. Jolene stood back up after her little adventure. Oh, that is pure pumpkin spice. That's actually wonderful. Of course it is, replied the shopkeeper. I'm a pumpkin. But let me give you and your husband a little bit of advice. If you want to come into here, guns blazing and acting like a raider, well then we are more than happy to oblige you. Or if you want to come and have a good time in the festival, then we're more than happy to oblige that as well. It's all up to you how you go about this adventure. So, I suggest you get a better attitude about you. See, Harold? I'm talking to you as well, madam. If you don't defend yourself, then we will happily keep you here for the rest of your days. Both of you have important lessons to learn. Now then, Harold, why don't you keep shopping in my store, and me and your wife are going to go over here for some alone time for a second. That's disgusting. Don't shame me, Harold. I love pumpkin spice. Harold continued to use the shop. It didn't take long for him to figure out that he could sell the cleaver and some of the other less important items that he just so happened to have on him. Things like knives and daggers that the various pumpkin monsters were carrying with them sold for a relatively good price. He then focused on buying ponchos and blankets, things for them to survive multiple nights, along with bottled water and food. Harold figured that as long as they came upon the vendor every other day or so, and as long as there was free popcorn coming out of the walls, all they really had to focus on was their defense. If they worked diligently and used their ammunition sparingly, they should be out of the corn maze in only a few days. Or maybe they'd get lucky and just stumble out of it. Either way, Harold was prepared for the long haul. Harold announced that he was finished shopping. The vendor jumped up on top of her supply of things to sell. I'm very happy to have served you today, and I do hope you are a repeat customer, she said. If you're done for now, I guess I'll be driving off then. Before the vendor could dismount the vehicle, the pumpkin upon her head stump exploded, and the sound of a gunshot rang throughout the entire labyrinth. Harold, Jolene said to her husband. That was not me, darling. They both looked over, and a man, covered in metal armor, was walking down one of the labyrinth corridors. Get back, Harold said to his wife. That's a raider. I recognize those kind of tattoos. He is a violent and dangerous man, even outside of this labyrinth, and who knows what he's willing to do to us. The raider quickly approached the vehicle as it was sinking down into the corn. With all his might, he smashed open the various containers and tried to grab out as many different items as he could. Harold picked up his heavy broadsword and told his wife to brandish the firearm. She didn't do it well, but she pointed it at the man nonetheless. Once the raider was done looting the vehicle, the items he wasn't able to grab sank down into the corn, along with the vehicle and the body. Aw, man, guess that was all I was able to get. He looked up at the couple who was brandishing weapons towards him. Whoa, no need for such hostilities, my dude. I did not want to interrupt your engagement with the abusive capitalist machine, my man. But now that your time is done, it is time for me to liberate that which I already own, my man. Well, that's certainly an interesting accent, Harold said. But you're a raider nonetheless. I know those tattoos on your face. Nah, my dude. I was a raider in the past that was tomorrow. But in the future where I am to become, I am only myself, my man. Harold put a hand on his own forehead. Please talk normal. I was no longer a raider, my dude, said the man. Then why did you kill the vendor? Harold asked. She was friendly. She would have sold you things. Nah, man, she would have exploited me. I am in a desperate situation, as all we are. Inside of this maze, trapped forevermore, we are doomed to an eternity of lurking around these corridors, only to have monsters upon us, my man. She comes in here and exploits us for material gains, my dude. That is not cool. The capitalist system seeks to exploit those who need with those who have and have not, my dude. Harold clarified. So you murder the vendors that are part of the labyrinth, but no one else. Exactly, my man. Besides, when I first came in here, I was still a raider, my dude. Still attacking everything as I saw it. And that means that the vendors' prices are too high for me to pay, my dude. I cannot measure up to the rate of extortion that they want from me for the lack of extortion that I engaged in the past, my dude. Harold shook his head up and down. Okay, well, I'm glad you gave up your violent ways. Rock on, man, replied the raider. Violence like poisons the soul, and when you have become immune to that poison, that is when you can truly change to be a better dude, my man. Okay, Harold replied. Either way, I think it's time we go our separate ways. Aw, bummer, man, but that is the path that you are on, and is the path that I am on as well. Although they cross, they do not run parallel, my brother. See you forevermore, and hope you find your way out of this maze, my dude. Yeah, sure thing, Harold said. Harold, what is wrong with this man? I don't know, honey, Harold replied. Let's just slowly walk away from him. See you, my dudes, the man said as he began picking up his loot. He was fully bent over on the ground, shuffling through the corn. Harold felt safe enough to turn his back and begin walking away briskly, his wife joining him. That's when the man's expression softened and then grew hard and rigid. He picked up his gun quickly, loading a round into the bolt-action chamber, and fired it. Harold fell to the ground. Jolene screamed as her husband fell to the ground. She rolled him over, screaming his name, Harold! Harold! When she looked at his chest, she saw a hole going right through it. Blood and gore leaking from the hole. He had been shot right through the heart. Harold! No! Whoa, looks like you put your guard down too soon, my dude, the man began to speak. Oh, that accent's pretty killer on the throat, but it never fails to get a guy off his game. He began to approach. Jolene brandished the weapon and pointed it at him. Quoth the raven began jumping about, frantically squawking in the tree. Jolene tried to pull the trigger of the weapon, but nothing happened. Harold! Harold, how do I load this, Harold? I don't know how to use this properly. The man continued to approach until finally he grabbed the weapon away from her and knocked her to the ground. Harold, like I'm just a useless woman, Harold. Do everything for me, Harold. Why can't you just be there 100% of the time for everything that I'm not there for you for, Harold? He mocked her in his stupid voice. Bitch, shut up. I'll get to you in a second, he said. Looks like your husband's as good as dead, but time for me to frisk through his pockets to see what he's got, and I might as well put a round in his skull just to make sure. Just then, they heard a ringing bell cast upon the entire labyrinth, accompanied with an inhuman voice speaking over an intercom. Rule violation detected. Attention guests. You are not allowed to assault each other. All forms of assault, whether it be mental, physical, or sexual, and all forms of force, whether it be deadly or non-deadly, must be left to staff members only. Please disengage from each other and stand by. You will be apprehended and processed. Please stand by. The raider laughed as he began to stand over Jolene. Oh, please. This place is nothing. I've taken on everything it has to offer. What could you possibly do to me? Just then, a headless horseman emerged from one of the walls. Its pumpkin was flaming, its eyes piercing with hatred, as it swung a lasso around its head. It began to laugh as the horse galloped by. The raider reloaded his bolt-action rifle and tried to level it against the Doulahan on horseback, but before he was able to get a shot off, the Doulahan threw a large lasso around the raider's body. The raider watched as the lasso looped around his legs. Then, the Doulahan's horse began to frantically increase in speed. Before the raider could react, the rope went tight and he was dragged away. Jolene watched as the horseman and her husband's assailant disappeared around a corner. "Harold! Harold, what do I do now, Harold?" she said to her husband's body. Another Doulahan came out of the wall and jumped off of his horseback. "Our most sincere apologies for the rudeness of the other guests," the Doulahan said. "Please, allow us to compensate you for your inconvenience. It is reminded that all guests are not allowed to interfere with the other guests' adventures. Doing so is considered sabotage and will be subsequently punished." "I don't want your money," she said, as she cried over her husband's body. The horseman dismounted and pulled an item out of his bag. It was nothing more than a small bandage. But when he placed it upon Harold's bare skin, it sank in immediately, and the hole in Harold's chest began to heal. A new color of skin grew over the hole, and Harold was revived. "What was that?" said Harold, as he woke up. "I felt like something burst out of my chest." "You were shot, Harold. You were shot in the chest. I watched your heart exit your body. You were dead." Harold looked down at his new-colored skin, a hole patched up in his chest. "I feel fine. In fact, I feel better than I did before. I'm not even tired anymore." He felt the new-colored skin. "It doesn't really match, does it? Kind of leaves an ugly scar." "We can assure you it is not a scar," said the Doulahan. "Oh my goodness," Harold said, looking at the headless man. "Oh, you are quite a bit more frightening than the night I fought." "Do not worry, we are not enemies, nor are we allies. We are simply enforcers of the rules. You have been compensated, physically. Now let us compensate you financially for your troubles." The Doulahan threw down some duplicates of items they already had, including a second pistol. "This is the end of your compensation. Please be warned, we will not arrive again should you fall victim to one of the maze's difficulties. However, you can be rest assured you will not be interfered with by that man again. He will be punished for his rule-breaking." For the next 3 days, Harold and Jolene saved up their money and bought only what they needed to survive, as they took down monsters that chased them throughout the labyrinth. Harold was certain that eventually they had to come to the labyrinth's end. They had to find the way out on their own, but to no avail. He figured they simply didn't move fast enough down the various corridors in order to make up for the fact that the maze was constantly changing shape, a fact that he kept in his mind but couldn't detect with the eye nor with any of the other senses. Jolene found using a pistol uncomfortable and difficult, scary at times, but considering the danger they were in, she eventually swallowed and got over her fear, firing at the various monsters that were coming after them. During the day, Harold cleared the way in front of them using his pistol. His wife covered their rear and shot at the few monsters that were coming up from behind. These were typically faster moving, but less armed and not at all armored. Harold was thankful for this, as it meant that his wife had to use the gun less often, and she would ask for his help less frequently. He knew she was trying her best to use the firearm and get over her phobia, but that didn't mean it wasn't any less frustrating, as oftentimes she would complain about the functionality of the weapon, or be fearful that the weapon would magically harm her in some way. It was by far the most inconvenient phobia to have in their current situation. Harold and Jolene jumped for joy when they saw a familiar face driving towards them. They knew they had saved up enough money for the pass out of the maze and were excited. Harold didn't understand the logic of this strange place. He remembered watching this merchant die the first time they'd met, and yet he had bought things from her ever since. In fact, many of the monsters he noticed were a simple repeat of monsters he had already fought. Damage to the pumpkin upon their heads or damage to the flesh of their body seemed to matter not. He'd see them again in only a short time, and have to fight them all over again. He wondered what was the point, and what kind of archaic power was powering this kind of place. Just for the amusement of having to fight monsters? He couldn't make sense of it, and the world was filled with enough monsters already. Certainly, if one wanted to fight them, they'd only needed to go outside. Jolene, in an emotional state, threw her arms around the merchant and gave the headless woman a hug. "I am so happy to see you," she said, nearly crying with tears in her eyes. "Oh, I'm always happy to see you two. Now then, what can I get for you?" "2 maze passes," Harold clarified. "We would like to get out of here already. It'll be nice to finally get on with our lives as normal." "Very well," the merchant said. She pulled a lever on her little car, and a cart rose from the corn attaching to the back of the vehicle. "Hop on. You can take a hayride right out of the maze." They both strapped themselves into the trailer that was now being towed by the small car. And immediately, as they strapped themselves in, the vendor began to press on the gas pedal and started thundering through the maze at breakneck speeds. "Now this is travel," said Harold. "Harold, I've been foolish. All my life, I've sheltered myself in a world of safety and comfort, oblivious to the harsh realities that lie just beyond. I thought I could avoid danger by avoiding the means to defend myself. But in this twisted maze, I've learned a powerful truth. Pacifism is not a virtue, but an ideology. It's a luxury we can't afford when our lives are hanging in the balance. I've put myself and you in grave danger time and time again. I'm so sorry. I'll never forget the terror of facing those creatures, helpless and alone. But together, we fought back and we survived. From now on, I vow to be a stronger partner. I'll learn to protect myself and those I love. And if you ever need me, I'll be there no matter what. We'll face whatever challenges come our way together. As for this firearm, well, I must admit, it feels oddly empowering. Perhaps I'll find a way to incorporate it into my wardrobe properly. After all, a well-dressed warrior is a formidable foe." "My dearest Jolene, I was a fool to underestimate the dangers we'd face. I dragged you from the safety of our city unprepared for the horrors that lurked in this twisted maze. I should have known better than to expose you to such peril. You, a delicate flower, natured in a world of comfort, were forced to confront your fears and fight for your survival. The blame for that falls squarely on my shoulders. I've been too protective, too controlling. I need to trust you more and empower you. And yet, even in the darkest times, there's beauty to be found. This strange headless witch, for instance, with her pumpkin spice-scented body and rather delectable treats she has to sell. It's a reminder that joy can be discovered in even the most unexpected places. From now on, I promise to be a better husband. I'll prepare you for the challenges that lie ahead of us. I'll trust you to face them with courage and grace. Together we'll overcome any obstacle, and even when the world seems bleak, we'll find a reason to smile." The two kissed as the car came bursting out of the corn maze and into a small field. "Here we are," announced the headless woman. "I do hope you've enjoyed your ride, but I have to get back to work. There are a couple of more people actually lost in that maze, and I'm certain they'd like to buy some things from a vendor." Harold looked on at where they were, and all the color went out of his face. Standing before Harold was a sprawling fall-themed festival town. It was nestled between three monolithic sites: the gargantuan corn maze that he and his wife were trapped in, a twisted, ominous forest, and a monolithic ziggurat, looking down at the other three, its top adorned with a dark mansion. Harold turned to the headless vendor. "I thought those passes were supposed to get us out of here." "They did, silly. The town is right there. You're out of the corn maze. It's a pass to the corn maze." Harold felt for a moment as though he were in pain. "You're telling me the passes only take you back to a main town that is part of this Fey territory?" "Absolutely," she smiled. "Oh, no. No, I thought we were free." The raven landed next to Harold. "Are we ever going to get out of here?" he said, hugging the bird's leg. Quote the raven, "Nevermore." That's the end of the 2014 Halloween special of The Legends of Theia. I hope you all enjoyed the ride, and I wish you all a happy Halloween.